So welcome to another presentation in the Trados Spring 2021 virtual conference series. In this presentation, we're going to learn a little bit about XML. So what is XML? Well, it's a well-established and flexible file type for handling structured content. And it's this flexibility that can make things a little tricky when it comes to translating them, especially if you don't have an understanding of the basics. So this session is all about basics. So if you already know about XML files and about how to handle them in Trados Studio, then this probably isn't a session for you. There will be more sessions later on in the event aimed at more experienced users, but this one is definitely coming at it from the beginning for basics. So I should just give a little introduction to myself and perhaps try and explain why I think I might be qualified to teach you about XML. So my name is Paul Filkin. I'm a Director of Client Services with RWS Group Technology, formerly SDL. So I've been with SDL since about 2006. And in that time, I've had teams, and still do have teams, who spend their time trying to help users get the most out of their software, to understand how to use the software, often at a very basic level. So I also spend time in our community. I have a blog called Multifarious, where I also try to write articles to explain to people or explain to users how to get the most from our software. Most of my knowledge has come from trying to answer questions that people are asking. So as a result of that, I've had to learn XML, not from being a technological guru before I even joined the company, but rather through trying to understand how to use it in answering questions. So as a result, I feel qualified to try and explain to somebody how to use it, and I'm going to try and impart some of the knowledge that I've gained over the years over the course of this presentation. So with that introduction, let's move into what is XML. So XML is actually a software and hardware independent tool for storing and transporting data. It doesn't actually do anything. So you can't double click it and it opens up into a nicely formatted file like a Microsoft Word file does, or Adobe InDesign. It doesn't actually do anything. It just stores data that gets used somewhere else. Sometimes it gets used in multiple places. And that's also why when you preview it, you just see code, because we don't know without having additional information explaining how to use the information in that file, how it should be displayed. So why is it called XML? I'm not really sure. My guess is that it just looked a lot cooler than EML. Although EML might be an email format, I'm not sure. But it's called XML, which stands for Extensible Markup Language. Now the important part here is that extensible bit. XML does have rules, but the developer has got complete freedom to extend those rules and use them as he sees fit. So there are no predefined tags as you get in HTML, for example. It's essentially made up of three parts: elements, attributes, and the content. There may be a little bit more to it, but at basic level, that's it. So let's just investigate what they are. To start off with, we take this string. That string in itself is what we could refer to as an element within an XML file. That element is made up of an element name, so in this case the title, an attribute, in this case the attribute is translate equals yes or equals y, it could be anything, and that attribute is made up of a name and a value. The name of that attribute is translate, and the value of that attribute is y. It also has an opening tag and a closing tag. So we can see the opening tag on the left and the closing tag at the end of that element. And in the middle we have the element content. And that's normally the material that we have to translate, that element content. So that's what it's made up of. Now there are some rules that are quite important to understand on that. And I'm just going to try and explain some of those because I think it'll be helpful. So we start off with elements. First of all, there must always be one root element. So here on the left, this is an incorrect way to write the XML, and on the right it's correct. The reason it's incorrect is we start off at the top with the declaration. So every XML file must have a declaration, and it must tell you what version of XML it is. In this case, it's XML version 1.0. Following this declaration, I've then got an opening tag and a closing tag. This will be the dots in the middle represent my element content, but I'm just keeping them as dots because I want to focus on the structure. So we have a text1 opening tag, text1 closing tag, a text2 opening tag, and a text2 closing tag. So essentially this file, if this was the complete file, is starting with text1 as an opening tag and closing with text2, which it is not allowed in XML. There must be a root element, so an element that starts immediately after the declaration and closes at the end of the file, so it opens at the beginning. So the one on the right, we have an opening tag which I've just called root, and it actually is called the root element, and closes at the end of the file after everything else that's in the middle. So here we have the closing tag for root element. So this is correct and is completely well formed and is valid. This will be incorrect, and if you tried to open a file like this in a cat tool, it would throw an error. Each XML element has to have an opening and closing tag. So here we have text is the opening, text with a / at the beginning is the closing tag. You can also have what's referred to as a self-closing tag. So here I just have the one tag written, and the closing part of it is written at the end after the name of the tag or the name of the element. This obviously wouldn't contain any translatable text because it's just an element in itself. XML elements are also case sensitive. So this would be incorrect, for example. Lowercase text as the opening tag and the closing tag / text. I should also say that when I'm referring to tags, I'm actually referring to an element or possibly even an attribute, anything that a cat tool will pick up and try and protect. And in Studio it would be with those little orange, or not orange, sorry, those little purple coloured markers that you see in the middle of a text so often. They are essentially elements or attributes within the file that have been protected, and we call those tags. So I'm just going to refer to them as tags. The elements must also be nested. So an incorrect version of this would be this one on the left, and a correct one on the version on the right. The way to explain that is that if you imagine a sequence of circles, you can see there that the circles, the first circle, the outer circle, starts on the opening tag of verse 1 and ends on the closing tag of verse 1. The inner tag starts on the opening tag of text and the closing tag of text, but it doesn't cross. They don't cross each other. They're nested, and they must be nested correctly. And the incorrect version, you can see they cross. So I hope that sort of explains what the concept of nesting is. But if you don't have correctly nested tags in XML, the XML is considered to be not well formed, and that will also throw an error within a cat tool when you try to open it up. If we look at attributes, attributes are really designed to tell us something about the element, so they're not normally intended for translation. So for example, here I have the element text, and in there it has an attribute called translate = no. And essentially what that's saying is it's giving me a message that I should not translate the element content inside that element. I shouldn't be translating the attribute value of no. Or I wouldn't expect to. I would expect to be translating the element content. Attribute names are also case sensitive. So in this case, these are two different attributes. So although they both have an attribute of translate = no, the attribute name in the first one is lowercase translate, and the attribute name in the second one is uppercase translate. And these will be seen as being two completely different attributes. Important thing to note when you're defining your rules, because if somebody used a capital for the attribute name and you wonder why it was continually being extracted or failing to be extracted, if that's what you were trying to do, it could be that the name had been written with an incorrect case and you just hadn't spotted it. So worth paying attention to. You also can't use the same attribute more than once within an element. So for example, this would be incorrect because I have two ID attributes within the same element. I can only have one attribute per element. I can have as many as I like, but each one must be unique. As I said there, you can have as many attributes as you like as long as they're unique. So if that one had been written ID equals 1, prop equals title, and ID type equals 2, that would have been fine. And because these are designed to be a property of an element, they shouldn't normally contain translatable text. But we all know that they do, and we often have to deal with it. And that can cause a problem for translators, which we're going to try to look at today. Now, if we move on to content, probably the most important thing to note about content is the use of illegal characters. So there are 5 characters that are reserved for use only by XML, and they cannot be used in the translatable text itself. You'll get an error. In order to avoid that error, if you're using any of these reserved characters in the text, you have to replace them with what's called an entity. And entities always start with an @ symbol like that. So you can see these have all got the ampersand, sorry, not @ symbol. These have an ampersand at the beginning and a semicolon at the end. The syntax in the middle is normally something you can understand. So in this case, for example, we have the left angle square bracket, which is actually a less than symbol, so less than LT. This one would be a greater than symbol, GT. This would be an ampersand, so AMP, abbreviation for ampersand. A straight quote, single quote, or apostrophe, so APOS for apostrophe, and a double quote, quote for quotes. And note these are quotes, these are straight quotes, not curly quotes. So if you wanted to use any of these, you would have to replace them with these entities, which quite often you'll see within a file. And if you wonder what they were, that's why they're there. So let's take a look at what that means, looking at some examples of some files. I'm just going to run through this first of all fairly quickly in the slides, and I'll show you this in more detail in Studio in a couple of minutes. So first of all, when it's very simple, all of the text is actually in the elements. So we can see here Soldier Freddy, poem by Spike Milligan, is inside the title element. Then Soldier Freddy is in a text element. Was never ready is in a text element. But Soldier Neddy was inside the text element, etc. All of the translatable text is inside elements. So if I just open that file in Trados Studio or any other cat tool, or most other cat tools that can handle some form of XML, it's going to look like this, and it's going to extract all of the text exactly as I wanted it without any problems. The only things you might have to deal with are segmentation issues. So if I look here, I can see that but exclamation mark Soldier Neddy was inside one element and should be on one sentence. But in Studio, it's been split, and that's simply because of the segmentation rules. So the exclamation mark is normally the end of a sentence. So you'd have to do some work with your language resources in order to avoid that if you wanted to, which is perfectly possible, of course. When it's not so simple, all of that translated text, in this case the same text, most of it is in attributes. In fact, all of it's inside attributes, the line attribute, apart from the first line, which is where this text, Soldier Freddy, poem by Spike Milligan, is actually in the title element. There is an attribute property to it, saying translate equals n, which you could assume would mean do not translate this element. So you'd have to deal with that, and you'd have to find a way of extracting the text from the line attributes which are within the text elements. If you were to open that in Trados Studio, or probably most of the cat tools that can handle an XML file out of the box, you're going to get something like this, where it's actually extracted the very content you didn't want to extract and hasn't extracted all the content that you did want to extract, because it doesn't know how to deal with attributes. You have to tell it specifically with some kind of a customization. When it's lazy, and I use this term to describe where somebody has used a CData section. So quite often developers will take the material they need to be translated out of another application with some sort of an export or writing a program to do it in a way that they can easily put it back into their program, and then they drop it into an XML file for you to translate, normally as what we call a CData section. CData stands for character data, and it's essentially just a block of text that doesn't get passed by any of the processors or file types within your cat tool. It's just handled as text, because that's what a CData section is supposed to do, to prevent you changing it and to render everything in there as text. This is a big problem for translators. Quite often we see XLIF files. XLIF are essentially another form of XML. And these XLIF files quite often come with very large sections of CData with code content like this. This is HTML in this case, just dumped into the source and target elements of the XLIF. And when you open them up in a cat tool, you end up with this sort of thing, the same as you do with just ordinary XML, where the cat tool has been unable to parse it as code and has just treated it as text. And in this case, you've only got 2 segments, and the reason you have 2 again is because of that exclamation mark where it segmented the text. Without that, everything would have been in just 1 segment, making it very difficult for you to translate for 2 reasons. 1, it's not segmented at all, so you're going to get no leverage from your translation memory, and 2, you've got to work around all the code. So not helpful. So those are the most common problems that we see. The other thing I wanted to talk about is what happens when the file is invalid. So when it's invalid, most cat tools are going to throw up some form of an error because they can't process the code. In this case, I've shown you Trados Studio, of course, and you can see from here that there's a lot of error messages. You can see by how much space there is left over here, where Trados Studio has tried to open this XML with every XML file type it has. You can only see 2 here because I'm right at the bottom of that scroll, but it will keep trying to open that file until it eventually opens it or can't, and in this case it can't. When you see this kind of thing, quite often people just assume this is an error or a bug in the software. If you're handling XML, it's very important just to take a bit of time to just carefully read the messages, and the messages are quite clear. So for this one, for example, it says the verse 1 start tag on line 4 position 6 does not match the end tag of verse 1 line 11 position 7. And that's because verse 1 start tag and verse 1 end tag are different cases. That's a lowercase v, that's an uppercase v, you can see it here. And this is not well formed and it's illegal in XML. So Trados Studio won't open it and it's going to throw an error and try and give you some idea of what's wrong. There's also other things wrong with this particular file, and it tells you in each case. So it's worth going back to the errors where I've quoted what you can find in W3 Schools. All XML documents must have a root element. All XML elements must have a closing tag. XML tags have to be case sensitive. They must be properly nested. And all XML attribute values must be quoted. And the most important note I've just put in bold at the bottom, the W3C XML specification actually states that a program or an application trying to use XML should actually stop processing an XML document if it finds an error. And that's exactly what Trados Studio is doing here. Trados Studio has many things built into it to actually validate that XML when you open it. And if it's wrong, it's going to throw up a series of messages and telling you what the problem is. And the reason the severity is error is because there are so many errors in this file, it cannot open it, and it probably wouldn't be processed properly in the application it's going back into. Unfortunately, some developers write in such a way that they don't adhere to all the rules that are there and have to be followed, so they can often process these files in their own application. But that does not mean that the CAT tool you're using is obliged to try and processing that is not a valid file. And so that's why you might get these sorts of problems. There are some good ways to find the problems with an invalid XML file by dropping it into a browser, for example, and I'll look at that in a few minutes. So with that, let's drop over to Trados Studio and we'll do a quick demonstration of how to handle these sorts of files in Trados Studio. So here we are in Trados Studio. I'm going to go to my file options and down to file types. And in my file types, there's a preview feature down here. And I'm going to use this preview feature to very quickly take a look at the files as we're creating them and to see how successful the creation of the file types has been. So the way this works is I can click on Browse, And here are the 4 files that we looked at previously. The simple elements, a not so simple version with the attributes, a lazy one with the C data, and I've actually got the invalid XML that I used. I didn't show you it, but this is the invalid XML file that I looked at. So we'll start off by opening the simple elements. We won't create a custom file type for this one, because if I open this and preview it, it's going to open the preview in another window, I'm afraid. So I'll just bring it up here. You can see that Trados has actually no problem dealing with this. And any cat tool that it can open an XML file will probably be able to open this without any difficulties. I say probably because some cat tools cannot handle XML at all, but the mainstream cat tools probably can. Certainly Trados Studio will have no problem with this. It's opened up the file, so we can see the whole thing like this. Every segment that was in there has been extracted, or rather every element that was in there that contained the translatable text in the element content has been extracted for translation. So that's easy. If, however, I was looking at something a little more complicated, such as the not so simple XML, when I open this file and I preview it, all I'm going to get is that initial element that, if you remember, should not have even been translated at all. So if I just open the file up in my text editor so we can remind ourselves, that first element, you can see that's the one that's been picked out there, Soldier Freddy, poem by Spike Milligan, was in the title element, which is why it's picked it up. And none of this text in the attributes has been extracted. And this title element even had an attribute or a property there telling me not to translate it. So I actually don't even want to translate that particular one. So we need to see how we deal with that. To do it, we need to create a custom file type. This is quite straightforward, in fact. All we're going to do is, while we're clicking on file types, we click on new. You'll find that there are 3 different XML file types you could create. I'd recommend you use XML2, which is the latest version of our XML file type. So I'm going to use that. First thing to do is to give the file type a name. I'm going to call it not so simple. And then what I actually always do is, under this file type identifier, I always copy the name that I've given it and replace the file type identifier with the same name. This is because there's a small orange tag in Studio when you open a file that, when you're working in tag ID mode, will display the name of that file type identifier. And it just gives you a double check that you're using the right file type to handle the files. This is particularly important if you deal with a lot of XML and you end up with a lot of custom XML file types, because sometimes you might wonder why you're not getting what you want extracted, and it could be because you're just using the wrong file type. So we give it a name. I click on next. I'm going to choose element rules. XPath rules is a more advanced way of defining what you need, because you can do a lot more with the XML file types in Trados Studio. We're going to take the element rules because we are dealing with some fairly basic files, in fact. So I click on next. I have 2 options. I can create the file type based on the default settings, or I can define the settings based on my XML file. So that's actually what I'm going to do. And the reason I want to do that is because when I click on the next button after selecting that file, it's going to pull some information out of that file, which saves me having to go to type it all in. So for example, the first thing is the root element name. The rule here is @. Where does it take @ from? If I look at the file, the root element is actually called @. So this helps Studio identify that for this particular file type, or all file types with a root element @, use the file type that I'm now creating, which is this one. So that's what that is for. This is part of file detection, and you can see it's number 4, file detection. I click on next. Namespaces are a little more complex. I'm not going to address those in this particular presentation. So I'll click on next, and you can see what it's done next is it's extracted all of the elements that I actually had in my file. So if I go back to my file and just pull this over here for a second, we can see verse 2 and verse 1. So verse 2 and verse 1. You can see the text, the title, and the @. Title, text. Note that it hasn't pulled out attributes, and that's because you could have thousands of attributes in a file and it would be just a ridiculous job, because most of them contain information that is not to be translated anyway, if not all of it. So no cat tool will pull that information out. And that's why you only see the elements in the translation, because it's not pulling any of the attributes out. So we need to address this in our file type. But the first thing I'll do is I'll just finish that. So I've now created my file type. Now if I preview at this point, I'm going to have the same as I did before. Nothing but the element that actually I didn't want. And that's because I haven't put any rules in place. All I've done is created a file type that contains a detection with the attribute, with the name of the root element and the parser rules that I need to use. So I'm going to deal with this by first of all making sure I don't translate this title element, and then I will deal with the text element and extract the line attribute text. So to do that, I'm going to remove or disable everything apart from title and the text element. So I'll disable that first one, verse 2. I'll disable verse 1. I'll disable ads. I could remove them, but I'll just disable them for now, in case I want to come back to them at some point. So they're all there. So the first thing I'm going to do is ensure I'm not translating title. So I click on title, I edit it, and you'll see there's a drop-down menu under the translate, and I have inherit, yes or no. I'm going to say no. So do not translate the title element. I click on OK. And if I just preview that file now to make sure that worked, when I look at the preview, I have not extracted it. It's now gone. So now I've got nothing being extracted for translation. So all I do need to do now is deal with the text. And you can see there's no attribute value in there. So I need to put an attribute value in there and tell it I want to translate it. So I edit here. First of all, I'll say translate yes, but translate the attribute. So I type line in to translate the attribute. I say OK. So you can see now I'm translating that, and if I preview, now I'm getting all the attributes available for me to translate. You can see it says in the document structure column, attributes. So if you ever see that in a file, you know that's what it is. And if you click on it, you'll get a little bit more information about where that attribute has come from. So that was pretty straightforward. That was our not so simple file type. Now let's take a look at our C data. This is probably the most complicated one, so our lazy XML. So in here, if I preview this one, I'm going to get what we looked at before, which is just all of that content extracted as text, which is not helpful for me. I want to be able to deal with this. And the best way to do it is to create a custom file type. So I'm going to click on New, XML2 again. We click on OK. We know what we're doing now, so we give it a name, lazy. Oops, lazy. The file type identifier, we type lazy. We click on Next. I'm going to use element rules again. I click on Next. Define the settings based on my XML file. So I click on Browse, pick the XML file, click on Open. Next. You can see it's pulled out the root element name this time is lazy, and that's because if I just open this up in my text editor, you can see the lazy file has a root element of lazy. See that down there and up there. So that's okay. And in Next, namespace mapping I'm not going to go into in this talk. And then I have two elements, and the reason I have just two elements is because the file only has two elements, one called Spike Milligan, one called lazy. So what I want to do is handle the CData content in a different way. And to do that, I have to try to process that information in some way. And the way we do that is by treating this content as embedded content. So you've probably seen this in many of the file types before. So keep in mind that this information is inside the Spike Milligan element. So if I come back to here, first of all, I'll just finish that file type. I'll say yes. So I've created my file type. If I just preview it, I can just double check. You can see because I haven't defined anything yet, it's still being extracted as text, as C data, like this. So I'm going to go into my file type like this and to the parser rules. You can see I only have two parser rules because there were only two elements, Spike Milligan and lazy. Lazy was the root element, which I don't need because it contains no translatable content at all. There is no translatable content here. So I'll just disable that. Spike Milligan, I always want it to be translatable, so I'll just set that to yes to always translate that because that's what I need in this case. And then in order to deal with that content that's been embedded in the C data, I need to go to my embedded content processing. So in the file type, I come down to here, click on that, and you'll see that there is a section for processing embedded content. I'm going to check that to activate it, and then I have a number of different elements and things that I can look at. The first one is inside C data element. So process embedded content inside a C data element with, and I have three options of three different mechanisms, three different types of files for handling that content. So I could treat the content as plain text and build some regular expression rules, for example, to deal with the tags. If it was a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that was embedded, for example, in a Word file, then I would use this one. This is obviously irrelevant for an XML file. But the HTML embedded content is very relevant because when we looked at that content in the file, just a quick reminder, you can see that it is HTML. So all of this is HTML code. So the best file type for me to select here in the embedded file types is the HTML embedded content. So if I click on that and then preview my file, you'll see now it's looking much better. All of the text has been extracted without all of that code, and I'm getting the HTML document structure information, so heading, paragraph, with all the different types of code that is being used in that file. What you'll also notice is now I have a lot of orange tags across the top, and that's because of the embedded content. So it's having to treat the file in effect twice. First of all, it parses it with the XML file type, the custom file type that we've just created, and then it passes it again, or at least it passes the segments I told it to pass using the embedded HTML filter. So that's why you'll have multiple tags in here. But this is much better. The only thing I might want to address is these break tags, the BR tags, and that's because I might actually want these to break, and in fact I do want them to break, so they start on new sentences. But the default for the break tag is there inline. So the way to tackle that is to make a slight change to the parser rule for a break tag in the embedded HTML file type. So to do that, if I just minimize or close up this node, the file types node, underneath it you'll see there's another node called embedded content processors. And if I open that up, there's the three embedded options I have. And if I look at the HTML and go down to the parser rules, in here I'll see all the parser rules. Now I can see immediately the break tag is down here. But if you can't find it, you can type the name in here and it will highlight what it's found. In this case it's found BR as part of abbreviation, but if I use these little arrows and say find the next one, then it's found the BR tag for me. So if you're struggling to see it, you can type it in there and search for it. I then select that, edit, and I just want to change, it's an inline tag, and the segmentation hint is may exclude. I don't want to may exclude, I want to exclude. And this will move it outside of the segment, which in effect will cause Studio to break at that point. So I click on OK there. And now if I preview the file, you can see that what it's actually done is present the file exactly as I wanted it, which is perfect. So it's taken the entire text and extracted it all for translation and has paid attention to the code that was embedded into that C data section by treating that code as HTML, which is perfect. So now I could happily translate that file and get the leverage I want out of my translation memory. So that's basically how you would handle those files. Now, Now that I've done those, I click on OK. The next thing that I want to do is show you how to deal with the illegal content, or an easy way to deal with the illegal content. And if I come over to my text editor, let me just close these files and open up the invalid file. That's here. Here's my invalid file. Now my text editor is showing me straight away there's a problem with this because it's all in red. But if you haven't got a text editor that does things like this for you, so that you find these things, the easiest way to do it is to drop it into a browser. So to do that, I'm going to open up my Chrome browser. Let me just close these things here because I don't want them. I'll just leave one tab open, and if I go and take my invalid XML file and just drag and drop it into the browser, the Chrome browser or a Firefox browser, these are the two best browsers for this, I believe, will actually give me some information to help me find the error. So here I can see there's an error on line 3 at column 16, at value, quote or apostrophe expected. So clearly in my attribute value I've missed these out. So if I go back to my text editor and go down to line 3, here's line 3. The reason this was red is because this attribute here, that's the entire thing is the attribute, but it's missing either a single apostrophe or a quotation mark. I'm going to use quotes and put these around them, straight quotes, and now you can see that looks better. If I save that file, so I'll save the changes, and if I come back up into my browser and I refresh it, that error has now gone, but I can see there's another error. This time on line 9 at column 36, the opening and ending tag, there's a mismatch between text, line 0, and text. So you can see that's a lowercase t, that's an uppercase T. So there's a clue around that, and it even gives me a rendering of the page up to the first error. So it's extracted what it could and then said I can't go any further because there's a problem with the file. So if I go back to here again, and I'm looking for, if I go down to line 9, I can see that the element here, the opening tag, is a lowercase t for text, and the closing tag is an uppercase, which is invalid. So I change that to a lowercase, Control S, and I refresh this file, and that's looking better. I got a little bit further. I now have another error, and you may think this is kind of amusing with so many errors in a file, but this is not that unusual. You'd be surprised how many XML files we come across that are full of things that make them illegal and cause a problem for people to translate them. And it's because not all developers respect the rules of XML, which is a problem. But sadly, we can't build a tool that can cater for all the variances of what somebody might do. They have to follow some rules somewhere. So in these cases, it's often better to give the client back, to give the file back to the client and ask them to fix the errors before you try to translate it. So we have here error on line 10 at column 17, entity reference. So here we have an entity reference expecting a semicolon. So that sounds as though the entity has not been written correctly and the semicolon has been missed off the back. So if we look at it and we go down to column 10 or to row 10, we can see here that I've got an entity that's been written for the ampersand symbol, but you can see that it's missing the semicolon that should have been on the end of that. So if I hit the semicolon, you can see it's nice and clear for me in my editor because I get a colored markup that is showing me what to do when things are correct. I can save that. And now if I come back to here and refresh the page again, still another error. This time we have another ending tag mismatch, lowercase v with a capital V. So on line 11, so if we go back to the file type, line 11, there's the verse 1, should be a capital lowercase v, the same as the other one. And while I'm at it, I can see, I may as well check verse 2, and you can see the same problem is there with verse 2. So I'll save that one too, Control S, and now refresh that file, and I've still got another error. This time, opening and ending tag mismatch, title, line 0, and poem. So this is a bit tricky. Title, line 0, and poem. This is giving me a clue that there is a bit of an issue here, and the issue here is a bit harder to spot. But if you'll note here, we have an opening tag of title. If I click on it, I'm still getting it red inside my browser, inside my text editor. And it's because there is no closing tag. So I could close the tag here and put /title. but there seems to be little point in doing that because I'm not actually writing any text inside here. So what I should probably do instead is just make this a self-closing element. So for that, I just put a space after the attribute value and a /, which self-closes that particular file, that particular element. I save it, and if I render the file now, you can see that I can see the whole text with no more errors. So a bit of a process, but that gives you some idea of how you can use a browser, because we often say this in the community, drag and drop it into a browser, and people never really understand what we mean by that. And this is what we mean. You drag and drop it in, it's going to pick the errors up for you quite nicely and show you where the problem is. And often the errors are very clear. So that's it. That's the end of my demonstration. If I click back over to my presentation, and we should have enough time, I hope, to deal with a few questions. But all in all, if we don't have time or if there are no questions, thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it useful, and I hope it gave you enough information to make a start at looking with XML files yourself and possibly being ready for a more advanced session where we have some on dealing with embedded content generally, and we have a session on XPath which takes the whole idea of dealing with XML files to another level. Thank you very much for attending. Enjoy the rest of the event.